We definitely have 3 people who absolutely love what they do, and they're ready to share it all with us. So please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Great to be here with all of you. I'm honored to have a chance to speak to my colleagues at NCCL. This is an outstanding organization. Kudos to John Roberto and his whole board for reviving this organization and giving us a place where we can gather and hobnob with our fellow wizards, as I like to say. We need that. And I'm also privileged to be on a panel with Lori and Bertha, and part of a dynamic trio, I guess, here. And so very excited about that. Bertha's going to tell you later on that she's been in ministry for 30 years. I said, were you 6 years old when you started? Oh my goodness. But anyway, we're going to talk about formation of catechetical leaders and catechists. So there's a slight disconnect in the program. It just says catechetical leaders, but John asked me to talk about trends in formation of catechists. So I was like, okay, I'll be happy to do that. But it all meshes together very nicely. As Paulette said, I'm now retired, so I have time to sit around and read books and things like that. I'm still getting writing projects done and hope to continue writing and publishing, just not tethered to an organization anymore. During this 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking about formation in a way that you're going to see this image that I'm going to be referring to of a pendulum swinging back and forth between emphasis on content and methodology. And throughout my whole career, I've been seeing this pendulum swing back and forth. It's popped me in the head a few times on its way back and forth. It's a bit maddening, actually, why we can't just figure out, the happy medium. We need both, okay? So that's gonna be kind of a theme of what I'm talking about. I'm gonna talk about trends in catechist formation through the lens of my career. So I'm retired now. I have spent 45 years in ministry, and a lot of it had to do with catechist formation, or at least issues pertaining to catechist formation, starting with my first job. So I was in high school, I started to think I wanted to be a religion teacher. I had some very good religion teachers. I had St. Ignatius Jesuit High School in Chicago. One of my teachers was Father Mark Link, who some of us older folks know is a pioneer in scripture study for Catholics. And so when I went to college, I majored in theology. I wanted to get the content. The Holy Spirit thankfully also whispered in my ear and said it might be good to learn methodology as well. And so I double majored. I majored in history and went through the education program and got certified by the state of Illinois to teach social studies. I never taught a day of social studies in my life. I used that training, that methodology, to be a good religion teacher. I wanted to know how to deliver the goods, not just to have the goods in my head. I was hired, I was a little thinner back then, had a lot more hair. That's me on the right, of course. I was hired in 1981 to teach religion at Quigley Seminary South High School in Chicago. This fellow, Pat Kenny, was also hired the same year. And so both of us were first-year teachers. And Pat had just come out of the seminary. He had left, decided not to pursue ordination. They said, wow, he's got all the content, right? He went 4 years through major seminary. He had all the content. Both of us during that first year had completely different experiences. Because of my training and methodology, I don't want to say that I just breezed through. It was a challenging first year, but very successful. By the end of the year, he was gone. By that, I mean, there were so many times he would come to me and say, Joe, how do I do this? The how question was huge, and it had been something he was never given. He had the content, he never got anything on methodology. And so this has been a reality that I have seen And every once in a while, that pendulum swings back to, we just need to give content to people, and if they have the right content, we're going to be fine. Which in my mind suggests that, well, if that's the case, then catechists can be replaced by artificial intelligence. If it's just delivering content, get a robot to come in and teach religious education, because they can have all the content. And I would hope you would all bristle at that idea that robots could take over for catechists. So, what happened as we went along? After I taught high school, I became a parish DR, as many of you here have been or are right now. And my best friends at the parish were the catechists. I fell in love with the catechists. I've said over the years I've had a decades-long love affair with catechists, just the most wonderful people. And so this is a picture during my last year there. I got the shoulder pads and my suit on from the 1990s there, and my mullet. And our first communion class, which included my daughter, Amy, right there, and her first communion teacher, Mrs. Rosemary Watts. And I just loved the catechists. I started doing formation for them because so many of them, they had such good hearts and they really loved what they were doing, but they were often asking, Joe, how do I do this? How can I do this better? How can I be more effective? And the more formation I started giving them, the higher my retention rate of catechists went. The more that they were nourished and fed and given skills, the more confident they felt and the more they kept coming back year after year. And the other thing that was important was the more I fed them, the more they came back. So they told me early on, they said, Joe, it would really be nice if you gave us a meal when we had our meetings. Like, sure. So we had lunch once a month on a Saturday and followed with catechist formation. And they developed what I call the insatiable appetite for ongoing formation. Once you get good formation, you just have an insatiable appetite for more. More, never ends. I laughed when I was standing in line to get my diploma for my Doctor of Ministry at Mundelein in Chicago, in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And they announced, so now the Doctor of Ministry degree, the terminal degree. And I was like, terminal? I'm done? There's no more learning to be done? What a strange way to put that. We're never done. We just keep on learning. And 2 months ago, I did a presentation in Chicago for catechist formation. Deb Brady, the director from the Archdiocese of Chicago, invited me to give a talk. 2 of my catechists from St. Mary of the Assumption were there. 40 years they've been catechists. And they were there to come to my workshop to say hi, because they had that insatiable appetite to keep on learning. 40 years into being a catechist. By the way, St. Mary of the Assumption is the parish that Pope Leo and his family attended. When I was there, he was in Peru, but I did know his father and his brother, John, who we call Jay. And I got to meet the Pope last month, September, at the end of September in Rome. And so when I introduced myself and I said, Holy Father, I was pastoral associate at St. Mary of the Assumption Parish, where your family attended. I knew your father and I knew your brother. And I'm waiting for him to say, oh, really? And he's shaking my hand. He goes, oh, yes, I remember. I was like, oh, my God, he somehow remembers meeting me, and I don't remember meeting him. I was so embarrassed. Maybe he saw my name in the bulletin or saw a picture of it. I don't know. Maybe we bumped into each other in the sacristy when he came back from Peru to say a mass. But anyway, what an honor that was, to meet the Pope and him. He said, oh, yeah, I remember you. I was like, wow. So, me and Leo, BFF. All right, during this time now that I'm in the parish, the catechism comes out, 1992. How many of you were in ministry, catechetical ministry, when this happened? Big deal when the catechism came out. First catechism in 400 years, right? And so there was a big to-do about the catechism and how to implement it. And the bishops, really got behind this. And they wanted, every textbook and all of our programs to be in conformity with the content. Content became king. Orthodoxy was the most important thing, that our catechesis would be saved, so to speak, as long as the content was right, and now we had the catechism to back it up. And so there was a lot of emphasis on the content. The conformity process was very complex, and so on. During that time, I finished working at the parish. I was told to finish working at the parish. And then landed at the Archdiocese of Chicago, where my friend Bertha is now the director. And during that time, I was in charge of catechist formation. And I absolutely loved telling people I went from taking care of 15 catechists in my parish to 10,000 catechists in the Archdiocese of Chicago. But we had developed a very decentralized catechist formation program. Decentralized meaning that we kind of oversaw the curriculum and we got speakers and so on, but if you and your parish wanted to host it, we could send a speaker to you, but you would take care of getting the catechist there and everything. And it worked fairly nicely for a number of years. Lots of catechists formed as time went on. But during that time, I wrote one of my first books called Tools for Teaching. It was actually the predecessor to the Catechist Toolbox. And the whole idea was I wanted to get those teaching skills that I learned in my education program to catechists, because I still saw so much frustration of flailing around. I know the content, but how do I talk to a second grader? How do I talk to an adolescent, pre-adolescent? How do I engage them? How do I make sure that they're not bored? All those things. And so that's when I wrote that. So that's me with my wife Joanne, and this is Carol Eipers, was our director at the time. How many of you remember Carol Eipers? She was a pioneer of catechesis, great lady to work for. Around 1996, NCCL worked together with RCL to come up with the Echoes of Faith Catechist Formation video series. And it was a huge excitement, a huge success, been used for many years. How many of you have been touched by Echoes of Faith over the years? Lots of hands in here. It still exists, but it really hasn't been updated, totally. So some of it is kind of dated, and things get dated very quickly these days. But that was huge, catechist formation being done by watching videos. Just needed your VCR to pop it into. Around that time, the General Directory for Catechesis came out. And all of us catechetical nerds were so excited. Woo! It was a wonderful document, it inspired us. And there were several parts of it that were my favorites. One of them was paragraph 30 said, "It remains easy to fall into a content method dualism." So that pendulum I was talking about, they actually wrote about it in the directory, saying you can't separate the two. The odd thing was when Cardinal George came to visit our department of catechesis, and he was talking about the general directory, he actually told us, "I really don't care about methodology, that's your problem. I just care about the content." And I thought, Your Eminence, have you read paragraph 30? It's like, you can't say I don't care about methodology, because in many ways the medium is the message. How do we bring across the message in a way that is engaging? Again, if we don't care about methodology, give them a document or a book with the content in it and say, read this. Here's the content. Methodology is key. The other thing that the directory said was that catechist formation must be three-dimensional. Being, knowing, and doing. They actually use the word savoir-faire. fancy French word, which means doing. How do you deliver? So I immediately went out on the road. I developed a workshop that I did across the country called BKD workshop, being, knowing, and doing. The being meaning, how do we just take care of you, the catechist, as a person? Make sure you have a relationship with Christ. The knowing, the content. Do you know the content? Are you smarter than a fifth grader when it comes to the content of our faith? And then the doing. Are you able to engage people in a learning experience? So I was thrilled that the directory did that, and a lot of catechist formations started to take on a more three-dimensional form. Along the way, I was asked to put together a catechist formation video series for 23rd publications, and called Empowering the Catechist, which again focused a lot on the how-to. We videotaped some catechists leading different types of experiences with children to show them how to do this. This is the catechist that I saw in Chicago. So this is like 35 years ago, and she's still a catechist now. At the same time, many dioceses were turning their catechist formation into a model that followed seminary training. And I think we heard this, I heard it from one of my colleagues that, this is what the priests knew best, the bishops know it best, that's how they were trained. Why shouldn't everyone's training be like seminary training? But seminary training for catechist formation does not work. And so a lot of catechists felt like, this is just going over my head. They told me I have to take a course on ecclesiology. I don't even know what ecclesiology is. Now, I'm not saying that we have to dumb down anything, but we need to speak to where people are at, okay? And to help them, go into a class with first graders or second graders and be able to bring things down to that level for them. Oh, in the meantime, we were also blessed to have a number of online resources come to help us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So many dioceses started saying for catechist formation, we're going to use the Catechetical Institute from Franciscan, or we're going to use University of Dayton's virtual learning community. I'm pointing to Rich Drabeck, who is one of the key people from the Dayton program, and then the University of Notre Dame STEP program. So there's lots of great resources out there that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And in fact, John Roberto, in discussions with him, has said there's a lot of good things out there that can be used. Maybe as NCCL moves forward and we get some more grant money, well, let's do something on catechist formation, but it's not going to be on content. It's going to be on delivery, because there's enough out there for content. But a lot of these programs do not tend to show, now how do I do this with 8-year-olds? How do I do this with 15-year-olds? And so on. That's what John is interested in doing. Finally, my last segment of my career has been at Loyola Press. The late Father George Lane was president of the press. I continue to grow a catechist formation series called the Toolbox Series that covered those three dimensions, being, knowing, and doing. Recently, I just, right before I retired, I released an update of the Catechist Toolbox, the 2.0, because the original one was 18 years old, which is like a dinosaur in today's world. The world has changed so much in those 18 years. And also developed an online formation series. So catechist formation, in my mind, it has to be a priority. I've been singing this tune for 45 years. We have got to form catechists. We've got to do it well. When we do it well, they will eat it up, and they will know that they're being fed and growing as a person. I'm going to finish by sharing two things. Back to that initial thought, we're heading into an era now of artificial intelligence. What role is this going to play in catechesis? There will be attempts to have artificial intelligence teach the faith. And we're going to have to be very wary of that. There's already been a few attempts online. Remember there was someplace that had an online priest that they invented, and you can go and talk to this priest who was artificial intelligence, and people figured out how to get him to say things that were mistaken and wrong and so on. It's just a mess. We cannot allow artificial intelligence to replace catechists. We have to form catechists. I have no doubt that robots might be catechetical aids someday. I mean, it'd be cool if I was teaching a group of kids and then I said, let's have Robbie the robot come in here now and he's going to lead a little review game. You know, and Robbie says, you know, what century was King Solomon? You know, it's, you know, something like that. I think they can help with the content. But robots cannot look into the eyes of the people they're teaching and see the heart and tell stories from the heart and tell stories about their encounter with Jesus Christ. And this is what catechist formation must accomplish. We've got to help catechists learn how to share their stories, how to talk about how their life has been changed, and to share their story. And many catechists will say to me, but I don't have a story. I'm like, yes, you do. They're like, what do you mean? It says, here's the first story you can tell. Tell your students why you're a catechist and how you became one. They're like, oh, yeah. And it's a nice short 30-second, 60-second story, but your life has changed. You used to watch football on Monday nights, now you teach religious education. Jesus has changed your life. And so share those stories. In closing, back to John Roberto's dream, he's hoping that NCCL can get some grant money and that we can invest in creating some catechist formation that is skills-based, that is going to complement the many fine programs like the Dayton program and others by a how-to approach. And John said, I'd like it to be like a cooking show. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you know, they show you how to make the recipe. We need to show people how to teach the Trinity to a second grader, or to an eighth grader, to adults. And so keep your fingers crossed, say a prayer that NCCL will move in this direction. I told John if he does, I'm on board, because this has been my whole life and I want to be a part of this. But we've got to make catechist formation that is skills-based a big part of our catechist formation. I'm done. Time to move on to our next panelist. I'll introduce Lori. Thank you very much.
So, when I think about this whole topic of catechetical leader, part of what I'm bringing is what I tell all catechetical leaders is we're graced to be in a community. That it's part of the challenge and the gift that we don't do this on our own. That we are speaking within a church as the ones who echo the teaching of the church. And so grounding what we say and what we do in what the church guidance is. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what formation for catechetical leaders, and especially parish catechetical leaders, looks like from the perspective of the National Directory for Catechesis from 2005 and the Directory for Catechesis from 2020. And you heard a little bit last night about the history of how some of these things have developed. And one of the things as we think about catechetical leaders, they don't have a chapter in the Directory for Catechesis specific to that. The National Directory does, in part because of what the conception of a catechist is in other parts of the world. In many parts of the world, a catechist is what we in the United States think of as a parish catechetical leader. And part of that is because those leaders are first and foremost catechists. That's actually what the Directory for Catechesis from 2020 says. So when we think about the formation of catechetical leaders, it includes that formation of a catechist. that being, that knowing, that doing. And that part of what happened with the General Directory from 1997 was a call in that, much like they had a directory for catechesis and then developed a national directory in the early 70s, they did the same thing with the General Directory for catechesis. They then made it a national one in 2005. So it's about a 7-year span. From what kind of the listening across the churches, there's not a current plan to make a national directory flowing from this one, in part because of the changing context. So what I'd like to share with you is a bit about what the national directory says is the responsibilities of the catechetical leader. And this directory was the first time that that phrase, parish catechetical leader, was used. And in conversation with those who designed this, they were amazed that that phrase was adopted. They didn't think that we'd now just naturally say, well, PCL. They saw it, again, it's kind of a broad category where now we've recognized that's a way of unifying, no matter what your role is, whatever age that is, whatever scope of responsibility, whether you're paid or not, you are called to this kind of responsibility. So it's actually on page 224 and 225 in the National Directory, where it talks about the single most critical factor in an effective parish catechetical program is the leadership of a professionally trained parish catechetical leader. This, for me, is one of those phrases like Joe had. It's like, oh my gosh, content and method, they're not dual. It's like, of course we have to train parish catechetical leaders. And while that is true, what that training looks like has changed dramatically over time. Many of you could share the same things I am today from your own experience. But for me, I think about, as an educator, I start with the end in view. So what is it that catechetical leaders are asked to do? So in addition to all those things catechists are called to do, the leaders, those who have the responsibility for guiding a community in this process, they're asked to give an overall direction for a parish catechetical program for adults, youth, and children. Again, that broader vision of the program. Or not even a program, is how we are in process, and we could get into that in a whole nother talk. But those leaders are about planning, implementing, and evaluating the parish catechetical program. They're about recruiting, forming, an ongoing development, and evaluation of catechists, of recognizing what we now use the term of accompanying, that they're to implement diocesan and parish catechetical policies and guidelines, including catechist certification, supervision, administration policies that, thinking about the time in 2005, about reported related to negligence, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and safety and protection of minors. Again, of looking at the time, and that you could be a leader and well-versed, but that sense that you need to keep learning, keep developing, because we're not teaching in a vacuum. It's looking at the broader culture. The National Directory also talked about collaboration with the pastor, other parish ministers, and appropriate committees, boards, and councils. So too, a leader recognizing that this isn't something he or she is asked to do alone. Recognizing that catechesis is part of the whole life of the parish. And assistance in liturgical planning. When I first started studying for my master's degree, it was the first time I'd ever formally studied theology. And I actually went to study liturgy. And then Jane Regan, who, if any of you know, was a pioneer in adult faith formation, happened to be at St. John's the same time I was there. And I got hired at the parish as a faith formation coordinator. but they would say, well, you're studying liturgy. Why are you studying catechists? Or I'd be in my other, or catechesis, and I'd be in my other classes, and I'm like, well, wait, what does liturgy have to do with this? And I'm in my heart going, how can you not have both in that? For me, another thing when I saw in this directory where it talked about having an understanding of liturgy is part of what's called for a leader's formation. And then attention to your own personal, spiritual, and professional development. So a sense that it's not just someone else who's delivering this to you, but a claiming for the leader that I am going to continually form. That, as Bill Hipsch talked about last night, is that sense of conversion, of recognizing that you are in this ongoing process, and hopefully having awakened in you, as Joe talked about, that insatiable hunger for continuing to learn with Christ, through Christ, for Christ in what you do. And it talked about, in the National Directory, the idea of having advanced studies in scripture, liturgy, methodology, educational psychology, theory, administration. That there were these breadth of skills that would be needed to do this well. And at the same time, as we get to the directory for catechesis, it talks about in chapter 4 that formation is an ongoing process under the guidance of the Spirit and in the living womb of the Christian community. So, and part of it is for us to recognize, how does that happen? Because the reality is, we know that not all of us have all the gifts to do everything at once. It's the rare person who has all of these skills at once. And that's part of recognizing why ongoing formation is really important. And why I think it's part of whatever we do in formation for catechetical leaders is about helping develop the ways to collaborate. Some of that is learning to listen. It's one of my personal missions, is to have people recognize, I don't know everything. I don't necessarily need to know everything, but I need to know where to go look when I don't know. And I need to help other people look. And I need to draw on others who have gifts I don't have. That God made us to proclaim the word and have it be effective together. And so part of thinking about then, what are the trends in catechetical ministry, in the formation of catechetical leaders? So what I did was, over the last few months, did a web search of all the Roman Rite dioceses in the United States to find out what they're doing in catechetical leader formation. And it was an interesting exercise in research, because I found the variety stunning, in a sense. Is when NCCL first came to be, it started out diocesan directors. There was a very clear that if you had a catechetical office in a diocese, this is what it was called. And it was usually religious education. It might have been part of Catholic education. Then for a time, it was a catechetical office. And then as the church has grown, it's evangelization and catechesis. In this last looking, it's as likely to be a discipleship office. It might be under lay ministry formation or pastoral ministry formation. It may not exist at all currently on a diocesan level. So for many years, in the directories, it's specifically in the the directory for catechesis talks about a diocese responsibility for forming catechists and catechetical leaders. Well, just like each of the places has had their own culture that shapes it, their circumstances may be different. So at the time of 2005, when the sexual abuse scandal was really rocking the church, In the last few decades, it's been around some financial situations and just personnel. We don't have the same number of people to do the same things we used to. And so there's been a shift in what that looks like. So places within that, I've seen most dioceses aren't doing that decentralized process anymore, where they have guidelines and then each parish is responsible for doing the formation, or the diocese themselves doing a lot of the formation of their leaders. Now, there are some places that do. California is an example that they've had a long-term system and they've continued to be committed to that. And some dioceses, like for myself, I had worked in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. And when I started, I was one of 23 people in the diocesan office that served parishes and schools in Catholic education. By the time I left 10 years later, there were 8 of us to serve both the schools and the parishes, and I was the only one with catechetical responsibility, and my real job was about parish service support. So just for a variety of reasons, there just were not the same number of people to do these things. Well, and many of you have experienced this in parish life too. There are fewer people asked to do more things. And part of what I've seen in formation when it's done well is really working with those collaborations. So a number of dioceses have worked with a local college or university to do some of the theological formation. That's probably the most common I've seen, but there's also some that include things like spiritual direction formation. That some it's about doing the lay ministry formation and the personal formation in that. Some have used the programs that Joe mentioned to provide kind of what I term the technical pieces of the theology or even the ministry skills, but then do what only the people can do. So they utilize the personnel in having the relationships with the parish catechetical leaders, of providing coaching, of providing retreats, of doing kind of specific workshops tailored to what those leaders need. And a number of them focus on time building a community. So things like the NCCL, as much as it is about learning things and taking things home, it's about what are we doing making the connections. So like for me, I think all of this formation, and particularly the role of a catechetical leader, is about connecting the dots. Now there's a general shape that we're all trying to go in this direction to a deeper relationship with Christ, but it is a sense of being able to diagnose in a way where the people are. How do we help folks be able to move into this ministry no matter where they're coming? So part of the reality that I've come to know pretty well over this last year of, I started out teaching in the NCCL certificate in the Practice of Catechesis program, and now I'm the coordinator of the English-speaking section of it, is that you have a whole range of people who are doing the catechetical roles. And like I said before, it has nothing to do with whether you're paid or how many hours you're given. So that the catechetical leader is coming for formation. They deserve it, as Joe talked about. That because we're asking this to fulfill it, I really believe God provides you what's needed to be able to do what you're really asked to do. And so what NCCL did in the wake of some of the other processes for certification nationally that sunsetted was bring together a set of competencies for parish catechetical leaders and clustered them in 4 main areas that resonate with the Directory for Catechesis as well as the National Directory. So looking at the role of witness and keeper of the memory of God, so that person who's in relationship with Christ in the church. That as a pastoral leader, that you're part of the mission of a parish. So it's not just about doing a program, it's about being with and extending the role of the pastor as a teacher in your community. Also a catechetical designer. So no matter if you're organizing one part of a parish program or you have the whole gamut, that you design what happens, that you're making hopefully intentional choices about that, so that you're able to plan, that you understand what's needed, not just the content. Who are the people? You know how to learn. You know about the people and what they need as well. And that you can design a whole process for learning. And then the final cluster is around educator and teacher. That there is certain ways that and things we do need to communicate, that there's something that you can't just know by your heart. I mean, God can do anything, but most of the time God works through ordinary ways. And so we do need to teach one another the language and the practices. But an educator also is someone who does that teaching in a way that helps you know you'll go beyond, helps you become confident in recognizing what you don't know, or even that you don't know. You're not sure what it is that you don't know, but you just know you don't know. And seeking out those who can help you learn, that you will be a continual learner. And it's interesting, Joe, when you got your degree, they said that, it's your terminal degree. And when I finished my doctorate, which is in education, it's like, this is your license to be a learner for the rest of your life, because you have to keep researching. But even thinking about, for ourselves, when we think about forming catechetical leaders, parish catechetical leaders, how are we walking with them? Accompanying them no matter how they start. Because when I started in parish faith formation, I had never had a formal theology degree. In fact, I was telling somebody yesterday, I had a scripture class with Gerard Sloyan, having no idea what that meant. There was just this visiting professor who knew scripture. And I was like, what? Like, Paul really didn't write all these letters? So realizing that you can be in the midst of a great opening and coming with what doesn't look like the credentials. But part of it is when that is that call, that God will provide the opening if we're willing to walk with and equip those who are called. So thank you, and I'm going to invite my colleague Bertha to share.
It is truly an honor and a blessing for me to be with all of you here, because this is a room full of wisdom. This is a room filled with history and stories and probably war scars of the journey. And it truly is awesome for me to just be in a room like this. I have about 30 years as a catechist and as a youth minister. No, I did not start when I was 6, Joe. Is that, Holy Ghost Botox that keeps me going. But in these 30 years, I really do mean it. You develop these war stories of what it's like to be in a classroom filled with young people that are just kind of looking at you like, all right, what is she going to tell me now? They don't want to be there, or they're there, they're sort of like, what do you have for me that is tangible, that it's real? Especially the youth today, especially the generation that we have in front of us. They don't want to hear about the faith. They want to know about the faith. They want to see how real and how true God is. So in listening to Joe and listening to Lori, but also even reflecting last night of those that have come before us, of hearing the stories and the quotes, it really brings together the fact that we are catechists. We are echoes of the gospel. We are those echoes of faith for many people, for many generations sometimes. And I realized over in lunch when I was walking the exhibits that I saw something. I'm like, oh my gosh, my CRE would love this. In New York we say CREs or DREs, PCLs. And then it hit me. My PCL, I taught that child when she was in 8th grade. And I'm like, what? Oh yeah. And it's a humbling moment because you see the generations. of, when I started at my parish, those are now the young families that are coming with their own children. And that is what catechesis means for me. It's that cycle, it's that echo, it's the words of life, as Pope Leo has said, the bearers of fruit. So with that in mind, when we look at these competencies, I see this as a skeleton. I see this as a list of ingredients. I love food, so we're going to talk about food. Think of a good stew. I always start my workshops with, when you are going to make a stew, and whatever you call it in your culture, what is the first thing you do? And people are like, oh, well, I chop the vegetables. And I'm like, no, you don't do that. Oh, I go to the supermarket. No, you don't do that. Well, what do? You go to your pantry first and see what you already have. Sometimes we're so focused on what we don't have that we don't realize that we probably already have some of these things going on. And what's more important still is that when you get to know who your audience is, who is your community, you also realize that this cannot be a literal translation. You cannot translate this exactly the same way when you're working with different cultural communities. And this is where I want to share with you a little bit of my work in these past 30 years, which is, what does it look like when it comes to catechetical formation for leaders and catechists amongst catechesis with Hispanic and Latino communities. And I'm going to do a reflection on this wonderful document that came out in 2023 based on this amazing thing that happened in 2018 called the Quinto Encuentro, or the Fifth National Gathering. And this was literally a process. It was not just a one-time thing. It was a multi-year process that led to this 3-day gathering of ministries of different kinds to have a conversation. And the beauty of it is that it wasn't just us Latinos there. It was also people from all walks and all different cultures there coming together, not to talk about what are we going to do with the Latinos, but it's talking about how do we become one as church? How do we as church really minister to quite a bit of people that make up the church in the United States? We, as in the United States, make a lot of assumptions about different groups, especially about Latinos. So I'm going to demystify the first assumption. So I'm sorry if I have fellow people from this, no offense. We are not all Mexicans. No offense. And I mean that with a lot of love. What do I mean by that? When people think of Latino or Hispanic Catholicism, people think of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Beautiful. She's the patroness of the Americas. I didn't grow up with that devotion. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in New York City, in an area called Washington Heights, which when I lived there, it was predominantly a Dominican community. My father was from the Dominican Republic, and my mom is from Puerto Rico. And when I lived there, it was like little Dominican Republic, and everybody was Dominican. As the years went by, there was a culture shift. And what was a very Caribbean-oriented community became mainly Mexican and South American. To now, it really being what we call the hipsters. And we knew when the first Starbucks popped in the neighborhood. So there has been this big culture shift, not just in Washington Heights, but across the country. We're seeing that different neighborhoods are now changing. And when that changes, the way we minister has to change. In my parish, when I started, it was at about 70% Irish. So we had really big St. Patrick's celebrations and all kinds of great stuff. To then all of a sudden we're doing Our Lady of la Nube, or Our Lady of the Cloud, Señor de los Milagros, or our Lord of Miracles. and all these other celebrations that I didn't know anything about. And I remember my pastor going, but Bertha, these are your people. What do you mean you don't know anything about it? I'm like, I'm not South American. But what did I do? I asked. Because the assumption was that we're getting these families that didn't know anything about anything. So I want to share this quote with you from the National Pastoral Plan. It says, the peoples of Hispanic Latino descent who have lived in the United States for generations, as well as those originating from the many nations of Latin America and the Caribbean, have a long history of transmitting the Catholic faith to the next generation and integrating gospel values and Catholic devotions into their cultural and spiritual life. The assumption is these kids don't know how to pray. And I would ask, well, how do you know that? They don't know the Our Father. They don't know the Hail Mary. Really? And I tested. Do you know your Padre Nuestro? Well, yeah, Padre Nuestro que estás en el cielo. They know how to pray. It's just that their worship language is Spanish, not English. There's the primary language, and then there's our worship language. And a lot of the times in the Hispanic and Latino communities, and I would say even in other cultural contexts, there's the primary language, which is English, but then the worship language could be Spanish, could be French Creole, could be Vietnamese. But we won't know until we ask. So what the pastoral plan is telling us is that there's a lot of cultural devotions and a lot of traditions that really have Catholic roots. We just need to learn, and this is part of the formation now of leaders, we need to learn how to make those connections. How do we now connect and actually let the families know, empower the families, hey, by the way, you do know your faith. When you do this, you're actually evangelizing your family. Growing up, I would have been literally like hit with a chancleta if I would have left my home without asking my mom for a bendición, for a blessing. That's very Christian. But if we don't take the time, we just won't know. And that's why that dimension, the dimension of formation that Joe talked about, which in my directory, I have this book at home and it's all like colorful and written up and stuff. That part, it was very crucial for me when I was a director of ministry formation at the Archdiocese of New York. It was like, a lot of us handle certain things, but the doing, that's where the gap is. We may know content, we may know certain things, but the execution is where it goes off the rails. I usually tell catechists and catechetical leaders, and sometimes they really get upset at me, and that's okay. I tell them, if you've been doing the same thing for more than 5 years, you're doing it wrong. And I get that, well, Bertha, I've been doing this for 20 years and it has been going very well. How do you know? Where are the fruits? Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But why wait till it breaks? When everything that's good needs maintenance. Our souls need maintenance. So it's this idea that we need to wait till something breaks or for something big to happen to understand. And that's where we're at right now. In the past couple of years, we have lost about 16 million Hispanic Catholics. 16 million, and this is not a made-up number. It comes from the Pew Research, so I guess they're the big deal on that. 16 million. And a lot of it, this is not all of it, but big reasons here are, for example, lack of engagement, unwelcoming parishes, moments of where do I belong? But also sometimes we overemphasize the first generation experience, and we completely disregard the ones that follow, the second and third generations. People like me, people like my daughter. I have a 17-year-old. And there's a lack of Catholic identity that happens. Why? Because, as we say in Spanish, ni de aquí ni de allá. I'm too Latina for my American counterparts, and I'm too American for my Latino counterparts. So I don't belong anywhere. I fall through the cracks. My daughter falls through the cracks. So if I find a place, such as a big, nice, beautiful church with amazing music and wonderful, beautiful, entertaining lights that says, Bertha, we love you, we want you, where do you think I'm going to go? Versus the sour faces and the, you don't speak Spanish, so you're not Latina. You have the wrong last name, so you're not American. And that happens. More often than not, it does happen. There's also other challenges that we need to keep in mind. And I'm just going to breeze through this before I walk out of time. We need to understand the family makeup and where they're coming from, their context. A family that's first generation functions very different than second and third generation. That's a fact. Second and third generation, we sit less at a table than first generation. But yet first generation parents may have a more difficult time in having certain conversations than second and third generation. There are also these generational aspects that we need to keep in mind. Generation Z has been a hot topic, but guess what? There's Generation Alpha coming along. Those are our little minis and our first communion kids. And boy, do you think Generation Z was crazy? They're interesting. They have a whole new language. Telling you. Don't start with the 6-7. I just saw someone saying that. So the challenge is, how do you bridge the generational gap? And a big thing with our communities is the wisdom of the elder. We hold that very tight. I remember how my daughter still loves, at 17-year-old, sitting there listening to the tea, to the stories that when my sister and I sit, like, oh, you remember when? You remember? And she just sits there listening and absorbing the history and the storytelling that we do. And it's something that we do even in our parishes through that oral tradition. And that still happens. But we have to find ways to bridge those generational gaps and bring intergenerational learning all together. So when we talk about effective approaches, or the doing, or how do we say it in French? Savoir-faire. I feel so fancy now. There's always creative ways. I was having a conversation earlier with someone that said, well, Bertha, the diocese tells us all these things that we have to do, right? We have all these guidelines that we have to cover. And I'm like, yeah, but there is still space for the creative. Storytelling, the oral tradition, the use of art, films, food. Everybody loves to talk about food. I know I do. In the Hispanic Latino community, small ecclesial movements are like it. You would go to a prayer group one Tuesday night, and it's to the brim. But half of those people don't go to Mass. And when you ask, it's not because they don't believe, but because they feel that they're not worthy to be there. They're not worthy to come to the table and sit with our Lord. So they can get at least as close as they can. So forging partnerships with these small communities. And lastly, Spanglish. In the National Directory, one of the recommendations is to recruit young adults and to recruit bilingual catechists, which is great. But it's not just about being bilingual, it's about being able to translate in a context. I had someone earlier sit through this presentation. He came up to me and he said, "Oh my gosh, Bertha, so I had a catechist that was from Spain, and I figured, well, she speaks Spanish, so she can teach my families in Spanish. And she hated them and they hated her." And I'm like, yeah, Castilian Spanish doesn't translate well with Latin American Spanish. But he didn't know. So it's not just being bilingual, it's being nimble enough to being able to navigate two worlds. Sometimes three worlds, depending on the makeup of your parish and the families. So with that said, I want to end with the words of Pope Leo, which love, love, love. And this is from the homily that he gave at Jubilee for Catechists. He said, "When we teach the faith, we do not merely give instruction, but we place the word of life in hearts so that it may bear fruits of good life." So I leave you with the question that I always leave, some of the parishes I work with. Is your work giving words of life? Or is it just merely, as Joe said, a robotic regurgitation of content that in reality is not, that doesn't even have meaning to the person that's even saying it? Thank you.